All right. And you are muted also.
It's a silent podcast today for
Yes.
lip reading purposes.
It's a very high concept.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I am Ben Burgess. This is Give Them an Argument. I am joined by our producer Jordan Dubin and by Varn Vlog host and friend of the pod, friend of many pods, C. Derek Varn. And it is 100% my fault that we're starting late today. So half of that is that is that traffic was backed up on my way to the studio, and the other half is that I was having trouble tearing myself away to leave when I should have, since yesterday got this dude. So adopted him. He was one of the kittens that were feeding at the Hollywood Forever Cemetery. So since he comes from a cemetery in Hollywood, I'm thinking, name from a scary movie, probably Ash.
Damien.
So, Damien would be good too.
Pazuzu.
Fair enough. Yeah. No, that's I also like this. TR Ellis says, I heard Kyle was in town bleaching Ben's hair. That's why he's late. It's good. You gotta get it from somebody who uses it themselves. In any case, yeah. So what we are watching today, thought this would be a little bit of an interesting departure. This is a debate from last year between Kshama Sawant, formerly the Seattle City Council, and a leader of the organization Socialist Alternative, and Eric Blanc, who wrote a book called Revolutionary Social Democracy, Working Class Politics Across the Russian Empire, 1882 to 1917, and it's called What is the Relevance of the Russian Revolution Today? And it's moderated by Bhaskar Sunkara, and there's also some other SALT, that'd be the short for Socialist Alternative. There's some other SALT guy there who I don't know, is Brian Koulouris. I don't know. I'm bad. I'm always bad with Greek surnames. I still I know every time I say Yiannopoulos, oh, actually I think I said it right that time.
You said it right.
Yeah, usually I add a few, Ian in, like I'm never quite sure where to stop, but yep. Oh,
yeah.
So
Varoufakis.
Yeah. Varoufakis, yeah. It always, I don't know, these names always look to me like I should be saying them slightly differently than I am, but I'm never quite sure how.
I think you got it down.
Fair enough. Oh, well, cool. So yeah, I mean, I think this is, I think this is going to be interesting because, people who, Socialist Alternative and groups of that nature are very interested in the Russian Revolution because they sort of see it as this, as a model for future transitions to socialism, and like if you've like done your sort of education in Marxism comes from one of these groups, it's very likely that one of the things you'll read at some point is like Leon Trotsky's book on the history of the Russian Revolution, and so there's like a very particular narrative of the revolution that I think they tend to get, and from what I understand about Eric's book, I think Eric Blanc is kind of trying to complicate that or maybe draw different lessons, from that experience. So yeah, thought this would be like an interesting departure, from the last couple of these that we've done.
And this is Haymarket, right?
The publisher. I
think it's a Haymarket like event even.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, which you just did as well.
I did, yeah. There was a sort of, right. There's that like socialism conference in Chicago. It's like that's, I don't know, somewhat associated with Haymarket.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not totally clear on the relationship there, but yeah. That's but yes, I did. I went to Haymarket.
Haymarket used to be ISO Press, and now it's associated kind of loosely with the DSA. So it actually, in some ways, seems to have moved from Camp Kshama Sawant to Camp Blanc. Yeah.
Right. So yeah, the ISO, if people don't know what it's talking about, that was another sort of soft Trotskyist kind of organization that I think dissolved itself like several years ago. And I think probably most of those people are DSA members now, although I kind of wouldn't claim to be super clear on that.
I'm loving soft trot as sounds like a music genre that you could mix it in with like smooth jazz, classic rock, little soft trot.
Be careful. This will come like a 4-hour podcast if you ask me and Ben to talk about the distinctions between Trotskyists.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to do the org chart, but just on a no, I know I have more of the org chart committed to memory than like can possibly be justified by any reason that anybody would ever need to know this in 2023. But so yeah, we won't do the organizational genealogies, but yeah, I mean, like, I guess roughly what I mean by soft trot is like there are Trotskyists who are like, I don't know, like outside of who like show up to a meeting to sell newspapers that have this like very odd old timey, font to them. And they're like screaming about how, I don't know, it was like bad to not to support the deformed worker state in, Pol Pot's Cambodia or something. And this is a little bit of a caricature, but, only a little bit. And that's like one kind of trot, like the trots who are going to like, they're gonna like, one of them's gonna get up to ask a question at the end, and it's actually gonna be a 5-minute prepared denunciation.
That's heavy trot core, I believe.
Yeah,
exactly.
That's heavy trot
our
core.
Spark core, as we used to call them.
Yeah, you got it. The Spartacus League is only one of the groups like that, but yes, that's one flavor of trot, and then there's I think a softer flavor that's people like, SALT, the ISO. Okay, so for example, even now, I mean, I don't, my limited experience with this, I don't know, a few weeks ago, whenever I was in Chicago, I went to a Haymarket Labor Day barbecue, and at a mansion that somebody donated to them, actually, weirdly enough. But anyway, that's anyway, I don't know what's up there, but like, and like one of the people who was there, that was Howie Hawkins, who was the Green Party candidate for president last time. And it's like these sort of soft trot groups like tend to like the Green Party as opposed to your what do you say, heavy trot core who would say that's like petty bourgeois, like you're doing like popular frontism or something, if you support that. So yeah, I think that roughly gives people the vibe of where these are at. There's a lot of they're all trots, so there's a lot of political DNA in common. But this is the relatively chill version of that. As
that's right. This is the lo-fi trot to chill and study to mixtape.
Exactly. Yep. Okay. Well, you want to get started?
Let's do it.
All right.
in revolutionary social. Hi, everyone. My name is Bhaskar Sunkara. I'm the president of The Nation magazine and the founding editor of Jacobin, and I'm very happy today to be moderating this event hosted by Haymarket Books, of course. And the occasion for this event, which everyone knows, is Eric Blanc's relatively new book, I guess new out in paperback from Haymarket, called Revolutionary Social Democracy, Working Class Politics Across the Russian Empire, 1882 to 1917. It's a really impressive work. Eric did archival research in many languages, more than 5, 6, 7, 8 languages. In Revolutionary Social Democracy, Eric focused beyond St. Petersburg and Moscow to the whole wide range of socialist politics and organizing that happened in the Russian Revolution. So the conclusion he comes to, of course, is that the Russian Revolution was a little bit less Russian than generations of scholars had assumed. He covers events in Finland, and I think Finland figures quite prominently in his account and in its relationship to our practices here in the U.S., in Ukraine, in Russian Poland, in a host of other places. I think he drives home a lot of important points, building on the work of other scholars about how we should regard the Bolsheviks and how exceptional they are. So I really recommend checking it out. I think we should really be grateful that we have a press and Haymarket that is willing to put out books like this, especially in a really accessible format. So it's available on the Haymarket site. I know there's a summer sale. I don't know the exact price, but the initial cover price was less than $40. So I would imagine 30, 20. There's no way to find out other than to click the link, which I'm sure is
master marketer right there.
Go to the Haymarket site. So the occasion for the discussion today, rather than just have Eric sit here and tell us about his book in kind of a dry academic lecture, though I'm sure he would have found a way to make it lively, was to kind of have a debate on the relevance of the Russian Revolution. And we have some really distinguished people with us to joining us in this conversation. We have Kshama Sawant, who of course was elected first in 2013 as a socialist city councilor as a member of Socialist Alternative in Seattle. And this was a really landmark event. I think that it's hard to overstate how weak and disorganized the socialist movement was in the US, and Socialist Alternative at the time was the group that ran several competitive races, not just in Seattle, but across the country, and really showed us that being a socialist didn't mean we couldn't engage in electoral politics, didn't mean we couldn't win. Then also finally, winning office didn't mean that you had to go on a steady march to the right, but in fact, you could use office and use the bully pulpit that it afforded to galvanize people and to build movements and to make socialism part of the common sense of people engaged in activism in the US. So, I think it's obviously not just the work of one individual, but she deserves a lot of credit there, and Socialist Alternative as a whole, and everyone else, in Seattle does as well. And we're also joined by Brian Cloris. Brian is a national organizer for Socialist Alternative. Eric, I've already introduced as the author of his book, Revolutionary Social Democracy, out from Haymarket, but he's also an activist within the Democratic Socialists of America, and he's the author of another book that was published by Verso in the Jacobin series, Red State Revolt. So I guess to begin with, on the question of the relevance of the Russian Revolution, we'll have an opening from Eric, and then after that, we'll pass it off to the other side. But Eric, do you want to get us started?
Sure. Thanks, Bhaskar. Thanks, Kshama and Brian, for participating. Thanks for Haymarket and for hosting, and to everyone out there. It's nice to be here. So to dig into it, I want to first summarize, I think, some of the lessons that we on the panel tonight agree on.
Stuck?
First,
maybe.
What's that? Jordan?
For some reason, I'm coming in really choppy and like it's a bit frozen.
Interesting.
Is it coming in smooth for you?
It is coming in smooth for me, but now that you've said that, maybe the chat will let me know if it's this is a more general problem.
Chat?
Eh?
Are we having a problem, or is it a Jordan problem?
Let's see. Oh, chat's not talking. All right.
Nope.
Well, okay. Jimmy Fedora says it's good for him. So,
if it's good for Jimmy, then it's probably good for everyone, and it's just me. All right, let's see what I can do here.
All right.
First, and maybe most importantly, the Russian Revolution showed that capitalism isn't eternal. It showed that working people can overthrow the current system and start building a society that establishes democracy in the economy and not just in politics. Second, it shows that the strategy to get to that goal is class struggle, not a strategic alliance with liberals or capitalists. Third, to overthrow capitalism, workers need their own party, and Marxists have a central role to play in making that party effective. And finally, the class struggle is international, and the struggle of workers in every country is deeply interlinked. So these are huge points, really important. I talk about them a lot in the book, but I think that there are points that we agree on. So I'm going to focus, for the sake of discussion, on where I think we disagree. I could be wrong, remains to be seen. And I would summarize it as follows. To put it simply, I think those in the Leninist tradition, including organizations like Socialist Alternative, tend to overgeneralize strategy from the Russian Revolution to context of capitalist democracies. And the fundamental flaw of Leninism, in my view, and this comes from the research I did and organizing experience as well, was to assume that a form of revolution and a form of party that was appropriate to autocratic Russia can more or less be transplanted to capitalist countries where civil liberties and democratic institutions are significantly more robust, even if they don't go as far as we'd like. And so more specifically, I think it's wrong to claim that the revolution illustrates the universal validity of a new conception of revolution as laid out in Lenin's State and Revolution, according to which the entire existing state would have to be overthrown everywhere through a mass uprising to set up council republics. And two, it supposedly showed the necessity for a new form of revolutionary party, one committed to democratic centralism and a revolutionary Leninist program. And by new here, I mean that this was a different form of party and revolution than the position long articulated by the left of the Second International, most notably by Karl Kautsky. And the founding myth of Leninism, I think I show in the book and we can talk about, was that supposedly the secret to success of the Bolsheviks in 1917 was that they broke from Kautsky's strategy, known at the time as revolutionary social democracy, and that supposedly all other socialists should follow them in doing the same. But as I show in the book, this is just historically wrong and it's politically flawed. Unlike in Germany, where Kautsky's revolutionary theories were ignored by the party leadership, in autocratic Russia, this theory was implemented not only by the Bolsheviks, but by all the other nationalities that led working people to conquer power in 1917-18, including in Finland. And this revolutionary social democratic strategy was premised on a correct understanding that class struggle and revolutions would develop qualitatively differently in autocratic and democratic contexts. And it was precisely this understanding, this distinction between politics and autocratic and democratic capitalist countries that Leninists tended to drop from 1918 onwards, or at least minimize excessively. According to Leninists, the Russian Revolution shows that socialists should seek to overthrow the entire existing state, even when a democratically elected parliament exists. The problem with this claim is that it doesn't actually follow from what happened in the Russian Revolution. They say that the Russian Revolution proves this, but there was no democratically elected parliament in Russia to be overthrown or to exist. And precisely because of that, Soviets or councils were able to fill the vacuums. So it's hard to generalize from the Russian experience, at least beyond Finland, to countries where such a democratic parliament does exist. And all the experience then during and since 1917 shows that where a democratic parliament does exist, workers will try to use it to meet their demands, including for socialist transformation. And that's the basic reason why a Leninist revolution has never come close to taking place in a capitalist democracy. And we should acknowledge that and sort of adjust accordingly. One of the underlying flaws in Leninism then is its assumption that workers in all countries of the world will sooner or later behave as radically as workers did in Russia in 1917. And honestly, I really wish that it turned out to be true. That would be fantastic if it turned out to be true. It hasn't turned out to be true. And so we should acknowledge that and orient to the working class as it is, not as we might wish it to be. And if we do that, it will help us avoid a tendency of Leninists and others to excessively blame like bad leadership, misleaders, which is often a real problem, but to excessively blame that for holding back the revolutionary instincts of the masses. There's a lot more going on for what it's going to take to overthrow capitalism in different contexts. The main reason capitalism hasn't been overthrown yet isn't that socialists have strayed from the correct revolutionary line. The main reason is that capitalists are very powerful and that most workers in capitalist democracies have oriented to making the state work for them rather than trying to overthrow it. Of course, it's true that if socialists win a majority through parliamentary means and begin to push for socialist transformation, capitalists will resist this with all the means at their disposal. There's no reason to expect that the capitalist minority will peacefully submit to the majority, but it doesn't follow from this that universal suffrage and parliaments are necessarily a form of capitalist rule, as Leninists claim. It just means you need to leverage the mandate legitimacy structures of winning a democratic election in order to effectively defeat the anti-democratic capitalist minority and the undemocratic structures of the state, like the police and the army. And so what I show in the book is that this is precisely what happened in Finland, the one part of the Russian Empire which had a sustained political freedom tradition and universal suffrage. Their socialists won a majority in 1916. They proceeded to try to implement the program in 1917. Then when the capitalists undemocratically resisted, Finnish socialists led workers to power in early 1918 to fulfill their mandate. And to be clear, my argument isn't that we should try to copy Kautsky today or that Finland is some sort of new universal model to be replicated. I think it's more narrow. I think what Finland does show is that revolutionary social democratic strategy could guide workers to power, and that the class struggle, and this is the big point, tends to develop very differently where there's political freedom and where real parliaments exist, as opposed to contexts where they don't. And the fact that the US today is the least democratic of the advanced capitalist countries doesn't mean a Leninist revolution is on the cards here either. It just means we need to dramatically democratize the US state to make both social democratic and anti-capitalist transformation possible. Lenin's claim that, quote, the democratic republic is the best possible shell for capitalism, end quote, which is often quoted by Leninists, severely underestimates the extent to which democratic parliaments were won by and for working people, that what democracy we have is a conquest to be defended and expanded. And it undercuts this conception of Lenin that the democratic republic is just a shell, the best shell for capitalism. This conception undercuts our ability to make a coherent case to working people that it's always the right, not the left, that wants to undermine universal suffrage and democratically elected parliaments, which we've seen most recently through the rise of Trumpism and the January 6th insurrection. And to be clear, I'm really glad that Socialist Alternative explicitly states that they want to base socialist revolution on a majority rule of the population. I think that's great, and we agree on that. But the fact is that both Lenin and Trotsky and other Leninists, particularly in these early years, explicitly argued against it. They explicitly argued, and I can give you dozens of citations, saying that Marxists shouldn't wait to win under capitalism majority of the population for socialist mandate through democratic elected parliaments, that they should win a majority in Soviets, which doesn't represent the full population. And after that, they can forge and win the majority after having taken power. And I think that's a conception we should reject. It's not helpful, and I don't think it helps move in the direction we need. As I mentioned before, and I'm going to go more briefly on this last point, the second major flaw in Leninism was its claim that the Russian Revolution demonstrated the universal validity of a new party model based on democratic centralism and strict organizational separation from socialists who didn't adhere to Lenin's new conception of state and revolution. And to summarize a big history, the story severely exaggerates the organizational coherence and programmatic unity of the Bolsheviks And in practice, this conception often tends to lead to sectarianism. Because Bolsheviks operated in an autocratic context in which top leaders had to live abroad, and which local committees were constantly get broken up by the police, the actual organizational practices of the Bolsheviks and other revolutionaries in Imperial Russia were extremely decentralized and fluid, way more than any organization since Leninist organization since 1917. So the historical record just doesn't correspond at all to the image of a tight and united party that Leninists have tended to try to replicate. Moreover, the secret sauce of the Bolsheviks, if you want to think about it that way, and other successful Marxists in the empire, like the Latvians or the Finns or others, was that they operated as relatively loose, fluid, and organic currents within a broader multi-broad tent, big tent party. And though exiled leaders tended to squabble a lot, Bolshevik leaders on the ground and cadre on the ground were always focused on building and leading that broader party as good faith partners with other currents. They weren't primarily intervening in this party just to build to their own organization. And because Leninists from 1918 through the present have tended to excessively wall themselves off organizationally from other socialist currents, and because they insist that only their particular conception of state and revolution is viable, their organizations have frequently devolved into sects, sometimes bigger, sometimes smaller. And I think then we should move away from that organizational conception, and our chances at building a majoritarian socialist movement depend on acknowledging that because there's never been a successful socialist revolution in a capitalist democracy, nobody can claim to have a precise strategic model for the way forward. And I think we should be skeptical of claims that that model exists and just needs to be replicated. So studying the Russian Revolution is great, but it's so studying the history of class struggle in a lot of other places, including after World War II in countries like Sweden, where workers and democratic socialists went furthest in capitalist democracies. And so to conclude, what becomes clear, I think, from this history and rigorous looks at other histories since, is that there are no formulas for socialist success in capitalist democracies. They're just strategic dilemmas to grapple with, which look differently in different political contexts. And that's why effectively pushing the class struggle forward requires concrete analyses of concrete situations, a large degree of tactical flexibility, and an ability to mix revolutionary dedication with a dose of humility and open-endedness. And I hope that my new book will help a generation of socialists develop these critical capacities. And I'm really looking forward to the rest of the debate. Thanks.
All right. Yes, I don't know how long to pause on this. I would like to get. Okay. Yep. Varn should be back shortly. I think that. I think there might be, more to talk about. We've got a little bit of the contrast, from hearing Sawant's part, but I guess I do see, just kind of glancing at the chat, I do see like a little bit of confusion about, what his argument is here.
Mm-hmm.
So, it might be worth just pausing for a minute to unpack that a little bit, and God knows we might regain Varn in that time.
Sure. Inshallah.
So yeah, it I think his I think his main point is just that he thinks that there's this kind of Leninist received wisdom about what the Russian Revolution shows us about how revolutions, how you should kind of expect revolutions to happen. I think the part of what he's saying that's like a relatively common critique of that is, is that this, that the circumstances of, the crumbling Tsarist empire at the end of losing World War I are just radically different from like what we're facing now in advanced capitalist democracies, and so it's like kind of a mistake to think that too much of this stuff is going to apply over. Lots of people say that certainly that state institutions have like vastly more popular legitimacy, certainly in like a country like the United States, never mind, a sort of real capitalist democracy, in 2023 than again, like Tsarist institutions had in 1917, or the sort of weird, like the provisional government, which, as suggested by its name, was provisional, after the first stage of the Russian Revolution in 1917 had. And so it sort of makes sense that you could get these alternative institutions, that there was a fair amount of support for just like having those institutions just like kind of smash up the existing state and take over in their stead, right? The Soviets of Workers and Soldiers Deputies originally, and then after that, like the commissariats that were set up by the Bolsheviks. Whereas you might think, okay, you need to like really rethink a lot of this in an advanced capitalist democracy. And I think he's being pretty explicit here that the point is not like, oh, therefore we can't have like a revolutionary transformation of society from capitalism to socialism, but he thinks the path to that has to, in advanced capitalist democracies, has to lie through sort of starting with capturing a majority and like some kind of democratic political process within existing institutions, and then when capitalists resist that, then you have to overcome resistance, and and at that point maybe nobody's playing by the old rules, but you have to at least start that way. I think that's his point. So like I said, I think lots of people would say some version of that. I think what makes Blanc's position different from what that sort of much more common critique is that he also did all this research on the Russian Revolution. I was reading archives in Latvian and shit like that, and he, I think he's trying to be very careful about it in this presentation, because I think he's trying not to overgeneralize too much from what he kind of got out of that research. But I think the way his Russian Revolution research is supposed to connect with this like not uncommon critique of like post 1917 Leninism is just the idea that even within the revolutions that were unfolding within the Russian Empire in kind of 1916 to 18, like there are other models that made sense even in like a place like Finland, which was this like weird semi-autonomous part of the Russian Empire, that like even their circumstances were different enough that the sort of revolutionary strategy that made sense was very different from in Russia. And then I think the implication, as I would read his argument so far, would be like, okay, if kind of what makes sense strategically is that different in Russia and Finland, then without saying Finland is now the model instead of Russia, you should expect like maybe what, given that like the United States or Canada in 2023 is even more different from Russia in 1917 than Finland in 1918 was from Russia in 1917, then you should expect this sort of socialist strategy that makes sense to be even more different. That's at least my best kind of read about his point so far.
Varn, were you able to catch any of the introduction that he made?
No, but I've like read his book. How did he like? No, we'll just move on.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, he basically. I think we got like a kind of. I think we got a lot of emphasis on the sort of importance of like winning the battle of democracy within sort of existing institutions, even understanding that capitalists are going to resist that. And then some sort of relatively nuanced, like, here's what you can and can't conclude from the Russian case, and in particular this Finland thing that he wants to bring up. But
I think it's funny if we're going to look at Finland as a separate model, if it's like come along a different path because of the kind of governance that existed there beforehand, or existing models of parliament, or even just the forces of production being in a different level than Russia. How has the Finnish socialist revolution concluded in a way that's like more beneficial or long lasting in the long term than the Soviet Union? Like, none of these are still existing socialist states, for one thing. So I feel like that's something that has to be beared in mind, and for reference, instead of just what's a better way forward. Well, forward to what long-term goals can we expect to achieve if we're going to follow this model, and simply pointing out the inconsistencies between what Lenin or Trotsky or anyone else would call kind of like an unlikely revolution in terms of what they were expecting to happen from a Marxist model, to what you got is okay, if it was decentralized simply because it was spread out across like a large area, is that not I don't know, is that not still sort of centralized on different terms? Did everyone need to take a democratic step towards this? And the Duma existed before the Russian Revolution as well, so I'm not sure even what point saying that was completely irrelevant is even true. But I find the question of how Russian was the Russian Revolution, simply because we're talking about a larger federated area that Soviet eventually is, I don't know. It seems to obscure something.
It's almost a weird Narodnik talking point, actually. It's something that I thought about when he wrote his book. And the other thing that I remember from his book is me going over and over again, like, well, one model that was still crucially dependent on joining up with the German Revolution that didn't happen, and another model that was still crucially dependent on joining up with the revolution that didn't happen, both of which end up being, I don't know, somewhat irrelevant, given that the German Revolution didn't happen. So, I mean, like, it happened, but it failed. So,
right.
And probably like somewhat like it's also, I mean, I think one of Eric's points that I think I did nod along to was this thing about how, like, in Leninist tradition, there's a sort of overemphasis on blaming every failure on bad leadership, and I will say, once you really start looking at what happened in the failed German Revolution, I'm not really sure that there's a scenario where that would have succeeded. I mean, given that this is like, okay, I mean, the Bolshevik Revolution probably wouldn't have happened in Russia if Kerensky had been able to, or had wanted to, or been able to, or whatever, had to, like, ended Russian participation in the war in, like, the first month after the February Revolution. And so the German case, this was all happening like as the war had ground to a halt. Like, and there are probably a bunch of other differences between the two situations. Not clear that it could have happened, but yeah, no, that's, so I guess to both of your points, like, it's, look, if what we're looking for is a model of a strategy that, like, achieved global socialism, then clearly we don't have one of those, because if we did, then this would no longer be interested, right? Like, unless we were trying to
we would
help
have had the answer.
Right.
Help people on other planets figure out how they can do it there, but we don't have that, right? And I also, and then, like, even in terms of long-term results, I mean, we all know what happened with the Russian Revolution and with the Finnish Revolution. I haven't watched this whole thing all the way through, but I mean, one of the parts I do remember seeing before they get into this very issue, and there's kind of there's some back and forth about whether, like, you can sort of blame something about this Finnish strategy or whatever for the fact that they were just militarily wiped out in Finland, where they weren't in Russia, right? So, but, like, yeah, certainly long term, those are two different kinds of failure. I mean, if the question is, like, how can sort of socialists take power within a country and then start to do things they see as, like, initiating a transition to socialism, I guess that's a different question than how do you actually succeed in arriving at at a flourishing and viable form of socialism, which obviously didn't happen in any of these places.
So I'm just going to state my bias as
Sure.
As a reviewer coming into this.
Sure.
That I suspect that I will be unimpressed with both sides of the argument. So
it's a lot of character.
So yeah, it's not out of character, but absolutely. I think I think we have to, we're really going to have to deal with the fact that there's going to be, like, the terms of the debate, what is the relevance of the Russian Revolution today, frankly, is a vague debate.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to be interested in hearing what the Trotskyist side has to say to it. But I also suspect I'm going to get frustrated because, frankly, a lot of Trotskyists repeat historical inaccuracies. And then a lot of the kind of, I don't know, we'll call it social Menshevik position to be charitable for Eric. The social Menshevik position tends to be historically accurate on the facts, but based off a lot of counterfactual. So it's like, we'll have to get into it.
Yeah, the idea that the debate is what is the relevance of the Russian Revolution today, I suppose it leaves more options than a binary of is it relevant today, where one side would argue yes and the other no. But I am very curious to see, just what can we take from it. And so far it seems to be for Eric that, there's not a whole lot. It's not relevant to today or now. It wasn't relevant even to itself in certain ways, and certainly not to neighboring countries. So we'll see.
He I guess, to be totally fair, he did start off by like listing off a bunch of things that it's like, hey, here's some lessons you could take from the Russian Revolution, but then like, yeah, this is all stuff we're going to agree on, so I'm going to drop this and go to the stuff we're going to disagree on.
Sure.
So that was all the sort of like, hey, capitalism, it shows that it's possible to overthrow capitalism, and the and class struggle is important, and you should just have long-term collaboration with liberals, etc. So there's like a lot of stuff like that. I should, but I mean, to Varn's point about the sort of broadness of the topic, because it's because really and I'm sympathetic, it's often like hard to set things up and know exactly how to how to frame things for, if you're disagreeing about a variety of different things. But I mean, I think like really what the topic is, hey, here's what Eric Blanc got out of thinking about the Russian Revolution. Seems pretty different from what like the sort of classic Trotskyist narrative of the Russian Revolution that people like Kshama Sawant are going to have. Let's talk about that. And that's in several different dimensions, some of which we've barely touched on. I mean, you mentioned kind of decentralism. So I think the point there is that, I mean, a lot of what Eric was saying about that, I mean, he didn't go into it in detail, but I think kind of what he was gesturing about at that was like, some of the same points that might be familiar to people from reading like Lardsley, for example, that like, it's not, that like the sort of idea of what like a Leninist party would be or is supposed to be is in many ways very different from what the actual historical practice of the Bolshevik Party was before 1917, or, really before maybe 1918, that like, that, that it was much looser than the sort of later model that they got out of it, so yeah, it's a little all over the place. We'll see if it becomes, if it narrows down any, but yeah, let's watch Kshama.
Thank you, Eric. Sama, you're going to head off first for okay, great. Go ahead.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this debate. I think this subject is of enormous importance to the working class, and I'm glad for Blanc's book to be published from that perspective, though I disagree with its main conclusions. I also think it's important that socialists be able to make their points clearly and sometimes sharply. It's not personal. Today's world situation cries out for genuine Marxist analysis and action based on the revolutionary potential of the working class, as the Bolsheviks had in carrying out the Russian Revolution, the most progressive event in the 20th century. Marxism means not dogma or eclectic dabbling, but applying an implacable scientific lens to events and drawing up strategy based on evidence and the logic of class antagonisms. Eric says that the underlying mistake by Lenin and the Bolsheviks was believing that the revolutionary approach would work in modern capitalist democracies. He chooses Kautsky's parliamentary road to socialism, requiring the election of a socialist majority to parliament. In this, Eric holds up the Finnish Revolution of 1917 and 18 as a model. The most profound and fundamental errors in this analysis are missing the lessons of both the Russian and Finnish revolutions and failing to understand the capitalist state. Contrary to Eric's faith in Parliament and Congress as a means for good, the brutal nature of the state under capitalism comprises all its institutions, not only the police, the courts, and the prison system, but also parliaments and the US Congress. Understanding this was central to Bolshevism, but it wasn't new. Marx and Engels themselves drew the same conclusions about the role of the state under capitalism through their study of the 1848-1852 revolutions and later the Paris Commune in 1871. As Lenin said in his brilliant work, State and Revolution, and as Eric has quoted but had drawn a different conclusion, as Lenin said, a democratic republic is the best possible political shell for capitalism. And this is true, even though Marxists have correctly fought for democratic rights throughout the history. As Marx and Engels explained, and as Lenin reiterated, the role of even the most democratic parliament under capitalism is to maintain class rule. The capitalists will fight tooth and nail against any attempt to use parliament to uplift the masses, and if it stops working for them, they will undermine or dissolve it. We cannot build socialism, which requires taking the levers of the economy into the hands of the working class, without confronting the brutal resistance of the capitalists and their state. As Engels said in the final analysis, the state is violent armed bodies of men who enforce the rule of the capitalist class by whatever means necessary. This was shown tragically during the Finnish Revolution. Inspired by the Russian Revolution, the Finnish Revolution broke out in late 1917. The capitalist class organized anti-socialist armed militias to ward off the threat of a Bolshevik Finland. The militant workers and socialists called a general strike that was so all-encompassing that workers were poised to take power. Eric, in my view, makes a crucial mistake in presenting the Finnish SDP, the Social Democratic Party, as a revolutionary alternative for today. In reality, the Finnish Social Democrats were deeply divided. The SDP had a big bureaucracy who lived a comfortable lifestyle with the parliamentary members enjoying especially high wages. This bureaucracy was increasingly getting close to bourgeois liberals, and the overthrowing of capitalism became a remote prospect. Because of this, they made fundamental errors like calling off a general strike after 4 days and at its height. Despite this, the revolutionary mood among the Finnish masses was so strong that large swaths of the working class and peasants understood the need to overthrow the capitalists as opposed to having faith in a parliamentary process. As the capitalists prepared systematically for counter-revolution, the SDP moderates were forced to respond to the mood of the masses and form a kind of workers' government in the bourgeois democratic framework. But the fatal theoretical mistake of the Finnish SDP leaders, even the most well-intentioned ones, was believing that the working class needed to stop there and to look to form a coalition government with the ruling class, that workers should not fight to seize power. The SDP leaders shut down workers' councils that were set up similar to the Soviets in Russia. They mistakenly believed in a reformist approach, that their electoral victories would mean that the capitalist class would be agreeable to a peaceful road towards sharing of power and then socialism, that the state could serve two irreconcilably opposing classes. Eric's writings unfortunately gloss over the bloody counter-revolution by the Finnish capitalists and the devastating defeat for the working class, with tens of thousands of the most heroic workers being slaughtered and some 5% of the entire Finnish population locked in political concentration camps. Sadly, these conclusions came from precisely the same mistakes that are being proposed here today, based on not understanding the need to smash the capitalist state through workers' self-organization led by a Marxist party, and that a situation of dual power will never be tolerated by the capitalists. These are not secondary details if one is proposing the Finnish Revolution as a model of the democratic road to socialism. Engels said, the working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purposes. The Russian Revolution was successful partially because Lenin and the Bolsheviks understood this. In contrast, the example of 1970s Chile shows the limits of electoral politics and the reformist road. A bloody coup was the consequence of failing to understand the need to smash the capitalist state and resolve dual power through a workers' revolution. I was in India in 2019 during the momentous general strike involving over 200 million workers. In some countries, the movements of 2019 went even further than in India. They saw situations of dual power, workers running the workplaces. None of those led to a decisive victory for workers due to the lack of mass revolutionary parties, but situations of dual power continue to occur. Eric claims that the founding quote-unquote myths of Leninism are that the Bolsheviks broke from Kautsky on the state and had a different organizational model than the rest of social democracy. These aren't myths, they are confirmed by major primary sources on these historic events and by the course of history itself. Lenin and Kautsky's differences on the state are documented in both of their central works and actions. The democratic centralism of the Bolsheviks and of Socialist Alternative today is based on maximum debate to find agreement. It has nothing in common with Stalinism, and it is actually the approach we use is also not alien to the workers' movement. When a majority of workers vote to go on strike, they aim to convince the workers who voted no, but everyone is expected to take united action. Socialist Alternative has led historic victories in Seattle, like the $15 minimum wage and the Amazon tax. Just yesterday, we won landmark legislation mandating Seattle police not enforce out-of-state abortion-related arrest warrants in the wake of the Roe v. Wade ruling. Each time, we have succeeded only by overcoming the unrelenting opposition of all institutions of the ruling class, by understanding our enemies in the state and in the Democratic Party, running with working class independents against the Democrats, relying on workers' organization outside City Hall, and building a unified democratic centralist organization that insists on all our elected leaders taking home only the average worker's wage. This is Bolshevik, that is Marxist politics. This is precisely why our track record of winning reforms is unfortunately unique on the socialist left today. In a time of renewed labor organizing and an assault on the oppressed by the right wing, DSA has unfortunately been stagnant, and I'm a member of DSA. DSA has unfortunately been stagnant and even has been declining in membership. We think this is due to their over-focus on electoral politics and connection to the Democratic Party. The Squad's example demonstrates how utopian it is to believe that there is a parliamentary road to systemic change. Their faith in the capitalist state and Democratic Party has meant that they have refused to engage in any semblance of class struggle and fight for the programs they ran on. They are less and less a point of reference for young people in struggle. The Economist carried a recent headline, "From Inflation to Insurrection." So we better be aware capitalist governments are building up their repressive apparatus. We live in an era of extreme capitalist disorder, inflation, recessions, food crises, war, and environmental catastrophe. If human civilization is going to survive, capitalism must be overturned entirely and replaced with a socialist world. Instead of a parliamentary road to socialism, using Democratic Party ballot lines and endorsing Biden, we should build our strength from below with clear Marxist politics and a struggle to end capitalism and all exploitation and oppression. Thank you again, and I also look forward to the discussion.
One thing, just while I'm thinking about it, that I forgot to say last time is on the thing that Eric Blanc said about the difference between Russia and Finland. I initially had the same thought. That's like, oh, hold up. There was a Duma in Russia before the revolution. What are you talking about? But I think thinking about it a little bit more, I don't know as much about Finland as I do about Russia. I wouldn't claim that, but I do know the Duma in the form that it existed, by the time the revolution happened was like constructed to be very, very, very far from like one person, one vote, that it was like almost more like the, I don't know, like the Estates General or something, that like you had like how many representatives per 1,000 people or whatever. It was like explicitly different for different groups of the population, in order to minimize the number of representatives from workers and poor peasants. So maybe that's the distinction that he's making. But while I was thinking about that, I just wanted to say that. But on what we just watched, what are you guys' thoughts?
I want to know what made Derek laugh so hard.
Chile being the result of a parliamentary failure is funny, since it was an internally organized coup.
Aha.
By a general appointed by the person who he overthrew, which could have easily happened in a non-parliamentary system. And in fact, a lot of what Chile did do was to follow neither the Bolshevik nor the parliamentary social democratic road, and that the Socialist Party and the coalition in which Allende ran took positions to the left of the Comintern Fund Communist Party, which was in league with said government. So I think that's just that comparison is one of those things I've heard for a long time, and it has always been to me, you have a very simple understanding of Chile.
Mm-hmm.
Some things that I think Kshama Sawant is right about. Lenin was pretty much a Trotskyist on most things, with one exception, and the exception is actually found in State and Revolution, and that is on the nature of the state. He actually cites his otherwise arch nemesis Anton Pannekoek as correct on the nature of the state, and says that Pannekoek is actually on the same side as Engels, which is true. However, I'm gonna push back a little further, because there's this thing that Sawant is arguing here that I find kind of interesting, that she's basically saying parliamentarianism is the ideal form of bourgeois governments, which is something that Lenin says, something that Marx and Engels actually imply. But socialist republicanism is actually something Engels does advocate, even late. In his letters to Kautsky, he actually thinks that the revolutionary road and the democratic road are the same, because the democratic road will have to eventually fight a civil war.
So actually, this is an interesting. Something I was thinking about during her presentation just now. I'd be interested in hearing your take on. There is this, I don't know, puzzle, at least to me. Maybe other people figured out about Marx and Engels's views on this, because Kshama quotes this famous line from the 1872 or whatever, introduction to the Communist Manifesto, about how the workers can't simply lay hold of the existing machinery of state; they have to smash it. But right around the same time, you get Marx explicitly saying in speeches to the International that actually we can, in a certain sense, to quote somebody in the chat who I think was not as optimistic about this, we can in a certain way vote our way to socialism. That of course you're going to run into violent resistance from capitalists, which Eric Blanc also said in his opening, but that there is this sort of road there that starts with winning democratic elections within existing institutions in those countries where you have the sort of most democratic capitalist institutions. And it's never, since I realized that Marx said the second thing, and that and he said it a few other times after that, and Engels said it a bunch of times long after that. It's been really unclear, at least to me, how those two ideas are supposed to fit together. Like what do we actually mean by smashing the machinery of the state and not laying hold of it? That's sort of consistent with saying that there's a sort of road to socialism through a socialist power party, taking power in parliamentary elections. I mean, I could maybe see how you could make those consistent, but it's it's just a little bit unclear to me what the thought is.
I can explain, actually.
If
you read the 1870 to 1876 letters to Liebknecht and Babel, which come up some of them are published in front of the Critique of the Goethe program, but I've been reading a bunch of them lately. They think that socialists can take the government electorally but only alone. Like, so they have to reach a true majority, and then they think once they do, it's going to trigger civil war. But their electoral road before that is almost totally abstentionist. And in fact, they threatened to leave the SPD and the proto-SPD and to not work with the German All Workers League and like every third sentence, it feels like we're going to leave if you guys do X. And what it always is giving taxes to a capitalist government, like every single time. So they think, yeah, you could seize the government democratically if you actually have a majority, and your only road to taking power beyond that is negative. So you just basically fuck shit up for the capitalist parties, or you'll sit on your hands or even aid on something that'll help workers, such as like state institutes workshops or legalization of unions. But even then, you're not supposed to take a position in the government unless you control the government as a majority. So that's their electoral strategy. The problem that I think that leads to, though, Ben, and I think it's a fair problem that no one really has ever reconciled, is like, how do you go from a party that fucks shit up to a party that actually runs all levels of government democratically? And it doesn't seem to me that Marx and Engels ever truly worked that out, because we also have to remember that, like, Marx and Engels, they're not anti-party, but they like, Marx barely talks about the party. And in fact, at times he even makes it very clear that, like, the party has to be subsumed to the real movement. Asterisk, I'm not going to tell you what the real movement actually is on asterisk. So there's a lot of ambiguity, and I think you're right, Ben, that even this kind of strategy of opposition that they have, it's them trying to square a circle. And I think this gets really, I think you can kind of see this, for example, in the Engels letters to Kautsky, that Kautsky later publishes, but then takes out all the stuff that Engels put in them about, like, the need for insurrection and counterviolence. And it's also interesting, for example, and maybe we'll get into this when we talk about the difference between the Bolsheviks' position and Kautsky's position, like reading Kautsky's Terror and Socialism, and then Trotsky's response to it, because it's actually kind of surprising how much they agree, and where they disagree, it's usually because Kautsky's going, your revolution's premature, you're going to have to rule as a minority. And by ruling as a minority, you're going to have to, like, do all these terroristic things, which are going to exhaust the general population, and you don't have a choice. And basically Trotsky says, yeah, like we are, but if we don't, we're going to just walk up from the revolution we just won. And by the way, you guys didn't win yours, so we're kind of sitting alone here. So, you know, it's gonna be interesting if that becomes a kind of pretext for this debate.
Yeah, I mean, so okay. I just want to make sure I understand the answer, because that was kind of all about electoral strategy. And by the way, it's probably worth saying as a footnote that it's like, it is interesting to think about how that strategy would be different from certainly the one implemented by Kshama Sawant in Seattle, that, like, all those things that she's talking about are, things that, to the extent that she can claim any credit for them, she was doing in, like, collaboration with liberal Democrats.
But in collaboration from outside within a third party, and not as tailing the Dems or coming through, like, the DSA or, a close alliance with Democrats from, like, a caucus level.
I mean, but okay, just technically speaking,
everybody on the city council is nonpartisan, but, like,
it's nonpartisan.
So in that sense, she's, I guess you could say that the people that she'd be working with aren't Democrats, but, like, I think, like, we can leave that language aside and say, like, that's one vote right on the city council, and the rest of those people are just regular liberals. So yeah, And I don't know. I don't know if she voted for budgets or whatever. But yeah, okay. So like that was all. That answer was all about electoral strategy, and but it's like, okay, so I mean, I don't think this is what you mean, but I mean, just to kind of draw it out, like I assume that the take isn't that what Marx means is you can't lay hold of the existing machinery until you have an outright majority and can form a government, in which case, yeah, then you'll lay hold of the existing machinery, right? I mean, you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, well, I mean, it does seem to it leads you to a couple of problems, because it seems like the idea is like you're abstentionist until you can form your own government, and then what you do with your government is literally supposed to destroy the state and rebuild it. Like that seems to be what he thinks you're supposed to do. And this is particular when you get all of his arguments. And this I didn't get from letters. This I got from the research of Hal Draper on what Marx means by the dictatorship of the proletariat, where he pulls up all these debates with the Blanquist and Blanqui about the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat is suspending the political rights of the other classes. Now, only as they are those classes, which is interesting. It's not like the descendants of these people are supposed to be shut out. That isn't implied at all. And then like the state, I guess, is supposed to like, see, this is not spelled out. I mean, I'm just going to agree with you, Ben, but it seems like what is implied by this is the state's supposed to like set up these like various cooperative forms of government with the workers and something like the early Soviet system, like, pre-1921, and administer it that way. But again, that's just implication. Like Marx's whole, like, I don't tell you what the future holds most of the time, except when I do in these letters that I keep private, makes it very hard to know what he actually thinks their strategy is. You always feel like he's kind of hedging his bets.
Couple paragraphs, the critique of the Goethe program, few places. Yeah, right. Yeah. Okay, that's fair. I mean, I just and I haven't read the Draper you're talking about. I've read some Hal Draper, but not that, I think. But I mean, like, it's also I would imagine very. I mean, like, there's got to be a lot of extrapolation there, because the actual phrase "dictatorship of the proletariat" is used so few places. I mean, this is that. It's
used three times basically.
Yeah, right, exactly, right. So and none of those come with a helpful. Just to be really clear about this, here's what I mean. Okay. Jordan, is there anything else you want to throw in, or you want to keep going?
No, it's just, this is interesting as well, because Varn and I are reading through the critique of the Goethe program, and we started with a very long breakdown of the context of reading the two letters to Babel, and who was the other one? It wasn't to Liebknecht.
It was Broca.
Broca, exactly. The first one, Marx to Broca, and then Engels to Babel. And Engels is a lot more explicit in his with regards to the critique and everything. But he says pretty clearly that you can take to a certain degree the bourgeois like rights and privileges within state to take them for granted and not make that the be all end all, that the socialist goal exceeds and goes beyond that. And I found how interesting it was to learn that that the critique of the Goethe program was so foundational to Lenin for a state revolution. So it'll be interesting to hear those names.
A lot of people's impression of what Marx says there is filtered through what Lenin says instead in Revolution.
Sure, I want to hear more about this from both of them, and it's interesting to hear Kshama bring up class politics a little bit more. I think Eric was a little bit more blasé about that, and what the working class means within a place wherein you have universal suffrage, and they can just be potentially represented by socialist leadership. But again, Engels there is kind of like universal suffrage, great, that's good. You know, if it's not just landholders that are voting or the nobility or whatever, but that's not enough. What we need is self-policing, self-administration, and in that sense, then the state dissolves. It just becomes an unnecessary category because the people are for themselves. So yeah, let's see.
Yeah.
Can I just say one more thing about it? I feel like that was the trottiest Trot speech I've ever heard Trot. Like,
yes.
I like literally, like, I've heard this speech 8,000 times.
No, I mean, it did have a very pre-canned. I mean, the fact that there's so
she read it. It was definitely pre-canned.
Yeah, I mean, the fact there's so many things that, like, in Eric's opening statement, he like anticipated and said, "Just to be clear, I'm not saying this," and then that she said in her opening, "So Eric says blah blah blah," right? You know, like, and it was exactly the thing he said he wasn't saying. But yeah, no, it was that was very yeah. Vard and I have both been around Trotskyist groups. We've heard that before. That is an old yeah, there's an old song, and it's not a particularly unusual remix of it. Yeah, yeah, I think this whole thing about the, you know, you don't need a state anymore, it's a neutral administration of things. Just I want to put a huge asterisk on that, and you know, that says, is that right though? And you know, can go back and talk about that another time.
Sure.
But
at least. Yeah.
I've got my doubts. But
I mean, Lenin had his state. You can't argue with that.
That's certainly true. Yeah, fair enough. All right, let's keep going.
Great. So before I bring it back to Eric, I wanted to bring in Brian to this conversation. And I guess, Brian, can you start by just, I guess, obviously, in Seattle and elsewhere, social alternative campaigns have gained a lot of mass support around, you know, really important demands around the cost of living, the cost of rent, supporting a fight for a $15 minimum wage and whatever else. So, but for you as an organizer, what role does particularly talking about, let's say, the Russian Revolution or the Bolsheviks play? Is it something that's useful for developing cadre? Is it something that you're afraid might turn off a lot of ordinary American, you know, workers or workers from anywhere involved in these struggles with us, but might have like a warped view of the Russian Revolution or the Bolsheviks in particular? So as an organizer, how do you balance that?
I think that working class people in struggle can understand a lot of complex ideas and often have a real thirst for history. If you're going to become a socialist, you're very quickly going to be confronted with, well, what do you think about Russia? What do you think about Sweden? What do you think about these questions? So I think it's really important on the ground to be versed in things and also to inform day-to-day activism. We don't start from the point of view of pretending that we're in Russia in 1917. We're constantly analyzing events and consciousness and where they're at to try and give us a picture of what types of demands and proposals will be necessary for the movement. But again, that's informed by Bolshevism. That's informed by what Trotsky called the transitional program, which is concentrating a bunch of Marxist activity over decades going back to Marx and Engels, which is proceeding from what working class people actually need. And in this time of food crisis, of inflation, of inter-imperialist war, of environmental destruction, what is needed is nothing short of international socialist revolution. You can proceed from that, taking into account workers' consciousness and where it's at, and how to build a bridge between what people will move into action to, which today may be defending abortion rights, to what's necessary by building a bridge. Medicare for all. The Democratic Party has not defended us against these right-wing attacks. That's why we need a working class party of our own. We need fundamental change to end all oppression that's typified in this right-wing attack. And that fundamental change, I think, is socialist revolution. And the Bolsheviks, I think, give us a very good model for that. And I think there are other historical examples we could get into. that are beyond the events in 1917 that show the correctness of the Bolsheviks' policies towards the capitalist state and towards building a coherent, unified Marxist organization as part of the wider workers' movement and always engaging with it.
So Eric, I'm wondering whether I could stay with you for a quick question and then probably have another quick one after that for you. But to begin with, Kshama talked about the Finnish Revolution. Finland, I think, plays a pretty big role in your book and a lot of your other work. I'm wondering if there was anything in particular you want to respond to, or more broadly, can you talk about what lessons you draw from the Finnish example? Because it does seem like the Finns took power, the Social Democrats in Finland took power, and then they were immediately crushed by the capitalists. And if they pursued another road, maybe they would have been able to hang on to state power. At least that was the common, I think, understanding of what happened in the lead up to the Finnish Civil War.
Sure. So I'll try to be brief. The answers to all these are sort of in detail and well sourced in the book. So you can, I think that, like, to get into that, you should check it out and see if I convince you. The really short version is, it's a strange argument to me to argue that the fate and ultimate defeat of the Finnish Revolution precludes learning the positive lessons from it. Because we should just be real. If the fate of what happens in the revolution after workers seize power is the primary criteria through which we judge the revolution, well, then we should also basically reject the Russian Revolution, which extremely quickly degenerated into Stalinism. So, so just on a basic, like, analytical level, it's hard if we should be consistent. I think we can acknowledge that the reason the Russian Revolution, the Bolsheviks degenerated very quickly into Stalinism is largely because of a terrible context. This is something that Bolsheviks argue in civil war. And similarly, it's a form of idealism to imagine that a extremely small Finnish country, even if they had the right line, were going to be able to defeat a German army that was far more equipped militarily, and they outgunned the Finns. And the Finns were hoping that the Bolsheviks would give them more arms, and they weren't able to, for reasons that we don't need to go into here. But so just logically, you need to be able to separate the question of how workers took power in different contexts from what happened. No one's been able to prove, and you're not going to be able to, that the defeat was because they took a parliamentary road. And that goes actually into the specifics of what that looked like. And I think actually it's useful you can compare it to the Paris Commune. The Paris Commune was also defeated similarly and was crushed. Nevertheless, Lenin and Marx both pointed to the Paris Commune as something full of lessons. We can look to Finland similarly. And incidentally, the Paris Commune also based itself off of universal suffrage, so it's quite similar. And on the specifics then of what the Finns did, this idea is just factually incorrect that they were somehow like advocates of a peaceful road to socialism, that they weren't expecting capitalist minoritarian violence, and that they just sort of like hewed fully to a purely parliamentary strategy. That's just like not close to what they believed or what they argued. So just if you look at the sources or read the book or just look what they wrote or did, this is not the case. They called the general strike. They literally led a working class insurrection in the defense of their majoritarian rule to have workers seize power. But they did that with a democratic mandate. They did that with a base on a universal suffrage mandate that they had won. And there's no way they would have been able to lead those workers to power if they had not oriented to the state that existed. And so this is the big takeaway. Again, it's not that they quashed an alternative route. Workers were not interested in mass in an alternative route towards Soviets in Finland because they had socialists leading a majority in parliament. They didn't have to quash anything because workers' dynamics diverged because the actual context in which they operated were different. And so unless we're able to look at how working class movements actually orient from below, we're not going to be able to have effective tactics towards leading them to power. And so that, I think, is the big lesson. It's the big difference that we have tonight. And I would just end with a similar question. If the burden of proof is actually on Leninists to not point just to defeats, because again, I think Soviet union is not particularly a shining example of success ultimately. So we actually have a lot of defeats. Workers have generally been defeated. We haven't established socialist democracy, but we can look to places where workers went furthest in capitalist democracies to get some clues about the patterns of class struggle. And what I would argue the Socialist Alternative comrades tonight and other aligners would have to demonstrate is actually like that their projection of revolution has some viability in context of capitalist democracy, and that hasn't been demonstrated tonight, hasn't been demonstrated historically, and therefore, even if it sounds like the best possible route, and maybe it sounds the most revolutionary, it's not necessarily the most realistic or the most viable. And so I guess my question to Brian and to Kshama would just be like, maybe what is your explanation for the absence of anything analogous to Bolshevik revolution in a capitalist democracy? And then the second is, do you think there are some differences in tactics that being and strategy in a capitalist democracy imposes? Because if you do, then we can start getting into it, the specifics. Thanks.
So I'll let either of you take that one on, and then maybe I'll come in with a follow-up question.
You okay with me taking it, Kshama?
Well, let me just say a few things, and Brian, you should come in and respond also. But first of all, I just wanted to say that I think this debate or discussion, whatever you want to call it, will be more useful if we, characterize the points accurately. I don't think we said that we should not learn from the revolutionary struggles if they ultimately were defeated. We didn't say the fate of the revolution erases the lessons. We're also talking about the Finnish Revolution. I think the difference between us is that you're drawing completely different lessons and in my view, wrong lessons from what happened with the Finnish Revolution. And I think part of this discussion is also pointing towards the need for internationalism, because obviously what happened with the Russian Revolution, ultimately the fate of the Russian Revolution, for that matter, ultimately also rested on whether or not socialist revolutions were going to succeed in other countries, because it cannot work in one country. And that is why we are also adamant about internationalism as Marxists, as Lenin and Trotsky were as well. And in fact, the defeat of the Finnish Revolution was part of what set the stage for what the white armies of the multiple capitalist countries were able to do in the civil war in Russia, where they attempted to absolutely obliterate the workers' revolution. And ultimately, the Bolsheviks did defeat them, but at such a severe cost, obviously, because of the price that they had to pay, literally in the blood that had to flow because of the violence directed at them from the white armies. That combined with the fact that Russia was isolated at that time as a workers' government, really, all of that led to ultimately, to this situation where we had the degeneration of the workers' revolution in the form of Stalinism and so on and so forth. So I think we do have to learn lessons from various historic events, but we have to learn the correct lessons. And the reason Marxists mention the Russian Revolution is one very simple reason. It's because the Russian Revolution was the only successful workers' revolution. And in fact, a lot of the social democratic speakers of today and of decades ago, they often talk about it as if, sort of just, as if the history was just on one day, like in Russian Revolution happened and then Stalinism happened, but you don't talk about what happened before then. The successful workers' revolution in Russia was able to carry out so much of what constitutes socialism that actually it led the Western capitalist countries in terms of many changes, progressive changes to society, whether it's women's rights, LGBTQ rights, workers' rights, and rights for ethnic minorities. And in fact, the Bolsheviks had a uniquely powerful position on the national question. All of this is important. And just last thing I'll say before I hand it over to Brian is Eric is being quite inaccurate. The SDP leaders in Finland, the ones that he's extolling, they did not call the general strike. In fact, it was the most militant workers who did that. And in fact, the role that the SDP leaders played was calling off the general strike completely prematurely. And they did that precisely because they had a very wrong understanding of what role the state plays and why it had to be a genuine revolution that overcomes the capitalist class.
Brian, why don't you jump in if you have something to add?
Yeah, real quickly on the Finnish Revolution, I think it's worth our viewers and people who read Eric's book to really look into the history of the Red Guards, not the way that name has been misused later, but it shows absolutely undeniably that there was a huge rift and division between the bureaucracy that led that SDP, it's so hard to get those letters right, and the most militant sections of the working class, typified in the general strike of 4 days and of the Red Guards in particular. So, we're told that we only have the greatest victory in the history of the workers' movement to point to. Well, I think we need to learn from defeats too. Chile in the early 70s is one that could be gotten into. But what was the best chance in, as you call, a modern democratic state to have a socialist revolution? I think it was France in 1968. This was not won through gradualism over time with a left government. These were explosive events under a right-wing government, an elected right-wing government that was elected through a parliament, which is in no way anywhere near as democratic as workers' councils. But there was a month of revolution, it was called, a general strike bringing in millions of workers. The right-wing government fled the country. They left. They gave up. The bosses were locked in their offices and the workers were playing them the Internationale and feeding them meals under their doors with the government fled the country. But there was no coherent, organized force. And Stalinism didn't just betray the Russian Revolution. They had a mass base in communist parties in Western Europe too, and they betrayed the revolution in France in 1968. I think, perhaps we want to get into Chile 1970 to 1973, but I think this shows that situations of dual power do open up in advanced capitalist countries. And I think that in today's situation, compared to the post-war boom, it's all the more likely that we're going to see situations of dual power open up with the type of extreme situation we face with the economy, with the environment, and with exploitation and oppression in general.
So, Eric, I just want to maybe have you briefly address this question of rupture. So if I'm not mischaracterizing, it seems like a lot of your argument is you build, let's say, an organization, or you have organized socialists that are involved in struggles, and the goal is to get to the point where you can develop something like a mass party of working class people. And from there, you seek a mandate. And if there's democratic conditions, a lot of that mandate would be in parliament, though it would be other activity to labor organizing and other things. But you expect that do you expect that it's likely that that mandate would be contested and that there would need to be a rupture?
Yeah, so there's we'll wait to get Eric's answer to this question because as Varun points out, private chat, there's quite a bit to cover here. I'll just I'm more dead inside than you, so I didn't start laughing, but I did I did raise my eyebrows at the claim about France. I think that there's certainly a wing of French students, who understood what was going on in the kinds of terms that he gives. I think the idea that most French workers who were on strike understood what they were doing in those terms, or sort of would have been down with like an outright revolution in France in 1968. From everything that I know about that, I think that's I think if that had been true, it would have been a very different situation. And that goes I think most of the work has much more limited goals than that. And I think that this is, in a way, it goes back to the transitional program thing earlier. That was so long ago, almost forgot it. But when Brian earlier invoked the Holy Transitional Program, from 1938. Anybody who's not familiar with this, so what they're talking about is this pamphlet by Leon Trotsky in 1938, the Crisis of Capitalism, Death Agony of Capitalism,
the Death Agony of Capitalism.
Yeah. Death Agony of Capitalism and the Task of the Fourth International, and it's the sort of opening line of the transitional program is this thing about how the crisis of the international working class, crisis of world capitalism is ultimately a crisis in leadership in the working class, and it's the same sort of. And it's sort of a very strange thing, because like whether or not Trotsky was right or half right about 1938 is one thing, but there's this sort of weird way in which in a lot of Trotskyist organizations it's like eternally 1938, and what Trotsky thought was true in 1938 is just true of whatever time they happen to be talking about, and it's so for example that it's the misleadership of the Communist Party of France is why is why there wasn't a successful socialist revolution in May 68, or that, and even why, like, even when you're talking about like the United States in 2023 where there's like 6% private sector unionization, it still ends up being that, it's really all about like bad leadership or whatever, you'd like the, I don't know. It often seems to me to devolve into denialism about more basic problems, but want to go to you guys.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many claims made. I was trying to hold it together on both sides on this one, because I'm like, I can predict what every person in this debate's going to stammer on. Mm-hmm. One of the things I was like, I laughed audibly, clearly at both I snickered at the transitional program, and I just laughed at the claim about 68. I could go into more about why, but yes, the government retreated, but also it was put down without a shot fired. No one ever attempted to establish a government, and the Mitterrand government clearly divided the communists in France almost immediately against themselves. Plus, the Trotskyist and the
Gaulle, you mean?
No, I mean Mitterrand.
So that's significantly later, right? It's the
it's later, but that's the result of the revolution.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay, go on.
But revolution.
Sure,
put it in scare quotes for people don't misquote me. But the other thing I was just gonna say is that it seems to me pretty clearly that also the Trotskyist and the formerly Comintern or Rallying parties, because there was no Comintern at the time, they were not involved in 68, and in fact many of them opposed it, but the people who supported it were not just all good, left-wing communist or social democrats either. There's the students, there's the workers' factories, there was also a bunch of weird Maoist parties involved in that. So like trying to characterize that as, it was dual power, okay, where the unions were actually in control of the French economy, that could have just, if they had just declared the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat under the right party banner, it would have all been okay. Just seems to me like that's an absurd counterfactual. Like, to go back to the transitional program problem, we always block out what's predicted in the transitional program, because what the transitional program is premised on is that Trotsky in 1938, just like most of the Marxist movement, including the Marxist-Leninist aligned with Stalin, were predicting an immediate collapse of capitalism, which was offset by the war, which actually led the Trotskyists to oppose entry into World War II, even to fight the Nazis, which is the thing that when you talk about Trotskyist history that they all just like shut up about, because World War II, just not going to talk about that.
Yeah, it's awkward. I mean, like, I think even at the time, I think there might have been some sort of sense that like this wasn't the same thing as World War One, and it's weird to like sort of treat it as if it was. Like they had this thing called the proletarian military policy, which is like, well, everybody should like sign up to join the army in World War II, but really it's just because we want to like spread revolution within the army, but also you should like, be the best soldier or whatever. That's like, I think very much trying to have it both ways. Like this is not how any of you guys approached World War One, right? To put it mildly, like you're doing this because you have some sense in which that this is a different situation, and it would like be inappropriate to quite handle it the same way.
And to think that you can make the soldiering secondary in the nature of being a soldier, like, no, we're just using the platform,
Well, I mean, it is actually an interesting problem, though, because it is a problem that socialists haven't addressed since World War One, which is like, why did the Bolsheviks do better than the Germans? And the answer is pretty clearly the soldiers fought with the Bolsheviks against Kerensky and the kind of, or at least they stayed their hands. And in the German scenario, the Freikorps exist, and you had this whole like National Socialism thing, but not just of the Nazi variety, also of like it was coming from several different quarters, like in academia, the German Historical School, in the military, there was like this Prussian socialist thing going on that kind of became German socialism, which was not just of the Nazi variety. It led to National Bolshevism and a few other movements. To say like, oh, well, it happens in the developed world all the time. I mean, the elephant in the room that every reactionary throws at every Marxist that we never have had an answer for is all of our revolutionary scenarios actually do not fit the model predicted by Marx and Engels. And that's, there isn't a way around that other than like, but it could though. So, I think that's a problem. Now, to turn it a little bit on Eric, Eric's whole like, well, degenerated into Stalinism. I think that's actually kind of a weak argument because one, Stalinism is a bunch of different things at different times. And two, a lot of the problems start pre-Stalin, if we're honest. They start during the Red Terror. Like,
I wondered about his formulation of that because he said like, because he emphasized the very quickly degenerated into Stalinism, and that made me wonder if he was sort of wrapping in the to be imprecise about it, proto-Stalinism, that was happening, like while Lenin, like the things about, Russian Federated Soviet Republic, I guess at that point, under Lenin and Trotsky that, and heavily anticipated what it became.
Yeah,
I don't know. I mean, I think his phrasing was ambiguous about that.
It was ambiguous, and he really did just throw it out there like it quickly disintegrates into Stalinism, as though, again, this is something that's just bound to happen as well, and he didn't give any reasons for why that would be the case.
To be fair, he did say at one point that was mostly because of these external factors that the, revolution did spread to Germany. Like, it sounded to me like he was sort of granting the sort of standard trot narrative about that. But yeah, he was going through this point like very quickly just to sort of like try to establish this parallelism between like, okay, one was immediately militarily crushed, the other one wasn't, but it also didn't become what we hoped it would.
Yeah.
The other thing that I would say that struck me as funny from a bit earlier when Kshama was talking about how Bolshevism sprouting up led to progressive changes in the rest of the Western world, and one of the things that she mentioned was like some sort of respect or appreciation or acceptance of ethnic minorities, and I thought like, this is the least Soviet thing I've ever heard.
Well, I mean,
theory and practice were really different on that.
This thing about the national question actually is a huge problem because like the Soviet policy of like national autonomy is radical. It's the most radical position taken. It's more radical than Stalin, who was considered pretty radical on the issue before the Bolsheviks came to power. That was Stalin's place in the party, was actually debates around the national question. So if like you read this, the debates are like between him, Otto Bauer, Lenin, Pannekoek, and Kautsky. The autonomy thing becomes an immediate problem because they start having to die back on it, but not again pre-Stalin as early as 1921. But then they're also doing this thing where they're encouraging this pushback against greater Russian chauvinism and also consolidating certain groups into national polities, and it's so much so that they're like inventing written languages for certain groups so they meet the criteria of being a nation. And lo and behold, later on, due to the wild shifting back and forth in the Soviet Union, particularly during the war Stalinism up through Khrushchev, it's very like they actually end up stoking a lot of national movements where there weren't any before against the central government by being really inconsistent, but they also managed to not really placate the Russian nationalists, because even in the period that we think of like during the war, we think of Russification, Stalin wasn't consistent on that even after he started doing it. So even after like the acknowledgement of the Great Russian Sacrifice in the Great Patriotic War, which is usually considered the beginning of Russification, he actually flips the national policies back and forth a lot between 1944 and 1952. So like they don't have a consistent policy on it. Sawant's right about like the sexualities policy. It is one of the ironies that the Bolsheviks have the most liberal sexuality policy of any state that had like formal laws about that stuff in the world. But then by the 1940s, they had like one of the most restrictive. I mean, So, and it was never, it wasn't entirely undone till Perestroika. So it's you know, it is the way it is. Now, there's a lot of bad faith arguments about that. You know, there's capitalists calling on, you know, I don't want to get into people like, oh, but capitalists, you know, talk about how bad Cuba was, which it was in the 60s, but they apologized, and the capitalist countries never did, and did just as many bad things. Absolutely true. But that's kind of irrelevant here when you're like citing this as great victories, but you're like, it didn't even, these victories didn't even last a decade. Right. Like they didn't make it past 1929 in a lot of cases, and some of them definitely were gone by 1936.
Yeah, so, I mean, a phrase I remember from my misspent Trotskyist youth is the first 5 red years after the revolutions. That's even put it at half a decade. I mean, to Jordan's point about the, you know, the Soviet nationalities record, though, I mean, it's like, okay, so even if this sort of question of like, you know, given room for certain kind of like national self-expression within the structures of the Soviet Union, even if that's a thing that went back and forth, like the, you know, the sort of theoretical Bolshevik position on the national question was pretty wildly at odds with like what they actually did from like pretty quickly after the revolution. I mean, like, you know, I mean, right away, then sure. I mean, they're not really in a position to like stop anybody from seceding, you know, from, you know, what had been the Russian Empire. But like even before 1921, I mean, they're, you know, when there's like no formal union yet, I mean, in practice, there kind of is. And, you know, certainly by the time they, you know, formally formed the Soviet Union with all of these, you know, with all of these sort of like on paper assurances that this is a voluntary union, you can leave anytime you want. There's you know, they'd already like, you know, they'd already toppled the government in Georgia with like very little popular support, you know, in Georgia, and like very little even like attempts to sort of go through the motions of being a revolution within the country. They tried to do that kind of with Poland, you know, like it's, I think that regardless of like what the sort of cultural linguistic allowances that were going to be made within it, it's pretty, like, even though, I mean, she's right that this was like Lenin's Lenin's position in like sort of intra-socialist debates before 1917. And, ironically, as Varun said, Joseph Stalin, was like kind of the leading theorist of that part of, Bolshevik policy. From very quickly after the revolution. I mean, like there's not a, like this sort of idea, like this sort of theoretical commitment to national self-determination. It's like, no, you got, like, we could talk about like what kind of status you're going to have within this, but
right.
Yeah, you're going to be in it.
It's so funny because obviously, I mean, your mind goes to this great area and nationhood abroad and there and everything, but like that rang funny to me in my ear because recently I'd been reading about the earlier Pugachev rebellion and actually the roles of indigenous people in uprising against the Tsar, and then the way that those people were treated later on after the revolution. The Kalmyks,
Yeah.
ever heard of them? Are a really interesting group because they're basically Europe's only indigenous Buddhist ethnic group. They were nomadic peoples, like from the Oirats, are basically like Turkic Mongol mix, and they were, immediately put into the Russification process, like their ethnic identity as peoples within Russia from prior, in the Federation, in the Empire, I mean to say, and afterward, they're just one group of many who were not, well treated or had their indigenous nature or ethnicity appreciated or respected.
Well, this actually leads us to a problem too, because ethnicity and nation is not the same thing in communism.
Yeah, of course.
And that, like, people who study this, like, well, the communists had terrible policies towards some of the indigenous groups. I mean, the way, quote, communist nationalism plays out, we even talk about like Stalinism again. It's very different in China and in Chinese communist circles, in Vietnam and in Vietnamese communist circles, and then in Russia and Russia communist circles, about how these like recognized and unrecognized, like these recognized national groups and unrecognized ethnic groups are treated. If you weren't a recognized national group, you were kind of screwed, which was also part of the whole issue with like the relationship of the Bund to Bolshevism for a long time. And then they do decide that Jews are a national group, not, which is not something Lenin actually really liked. And so these are all problems when you and people like, I'm seeing a lot of people comment going in this far field of debate. Part of the problem is when you have this, what is the relevance of the Russian Revolution today? And people can just throw all this stuff out, right? Like, frankly, all of this is relevant today. I mean, like, we can very much learn from what the Bolsheviks did and didn't do, and what Finland did and didn't do. And I actually, to go back to Eric's point, I do sort of think his, like, well, it would be idealist to say that the capital, I mean, the Germans would not be able to crush the Finnish state. And I'm like, yeah, but that's sort of, your argument about their democracy is also kind of predicated on them being small. And so, like, in some ways, the very structures that you're arguing for, from even a second international perspective, actually put you at a distinct disadvantage for arguing for their survivability. So far, it's like, this is like love is in the score, in my opinion. I don't shut up.
Fair enough.
Let's continue. Wait, before we go, what was the gist of the question that Bhaskar had asked, Eric?
Yeah, that was a while ago. So he'd asked basically about, I think basically what he was doing is prompting him to sort of repeat and go into more detail about something he did say in his opening, but he said sort of very quickly,
okay,
which is like, hey, you do expect there to be like violent capitalist resistance
right.
the
Okay.
democratic road to socialism. There has to be some sort of more basic rupture at some point, right?
Oh, sure. Okay, looking forward to this.
Yep.
Is that too formulaic, or do you see what I'm getting at? Like, obviously, it seems like you both had invoked rupture, right, and breaking with the capitalist state. So I just wondering if you could define kind of what that means to you.
Sure. Yeah, I think the difference between our perspectives isn't, as is usually claimed, or maybe it was said tonight as well, that sort of one side, my side or Kautsky or whatever, underestimates what the capitalists will do and underestimates the necessity for some sort of institutional break and even potentially violence, if it comes to that, against to defend the revolution. This is like classic Second International Marxism as far as the left goes. Everyone expected the capitalists to be anti-democratic, and that the fight to expand democracy, both politically and economically, was going to come up against a tremendous amount of institutional and economic sabotage, essentially. And so the expectation was that winning a majority was not going to be sufficient. It wasn't going to lead to some sort of just like peaceful acceptance of majority rule, but rather that the ability to defeat the minority capitalists and whatever power they had within the state, whether it's army generals or police, was going to depend on being able to lean on those parts of the state that were democratic and that were conquests of workers, and parliaments were conquests of working class. That's who the working class fought to win parliament. They won that, and they looked at that as an instrument potentially for their emancipation. So I think that the difference we have is not whether a rupture is likely, I think we agree on that, but whether you can have an effective, I put it this way, whether you can either have an effective rupture if you as socialists, in a context in which a parliament exists, aren't actively orienting to win a majority through that. If you reject that strategy, I think history is pretty clear that you're going to remain a relatively marginal force amongst the working class. And this is the problem, is that when in practice, what has happened to Leninists in capitalist democracies, they tend to be marginal, and they tend to hope that the working class will eventually see that their misleaders are misleading them, and that they will come around to the correct, Leninist line and party. That's just like, we should just look, the last 100 years, that has not proven to be the case. So the mechanism through which you would get to rupture, I think, has to look different. It has to look much more towards combining and looking at equally strategically relevant as both electoral politics and mass struggle, as these having to be reciprocally based, and that you have to own and orient towards the question of winning a majority and defending that against the capitalist majority. If you leave that ambiguous, which I think Leninists do leave ambiguous, then I think the proof is in the pudding that you will never even get close to getting that majority that you want. And I'll just say one last thing as far as examples, because I don't want to go back into the Finns. If we look at today, where left movements in the world are advancing the furthest, it's Latin America, where it's precisely this dynamic. It's not that workers, including where there's been mass sort of insurgencies like Chile, it's not that they've tried to build workers' councils and overthrow parliaments. They've tried to democratize the state, and they've oftentimes moved quite far on that. And so I see the road towards some sort of socialist transformation is going to look much more like the processes we're seeing in Chile or throughout Latin America. And it is really hard, and we could get defeated. There's no recipes, but the idea that Leninism is a recipe is kind of hard to jive with its relative marginality in these processes, and really through most of the last 100 years in capitalist democracies.
So maybe Sama, I think you mentioned or invoked democratic centralism as a principle, and I'm wondering, do you think there was something unique in the Bolshevik under Lenin formula of democratic centralism that was different than the way that it was invoked before or used before by social democrats in the Second International, or after by the Zinoviev kind of later era of the Soviets? So in other words, democratic centralism broadly, right, is freedom of discussion, unity in action. And I'm just wondering whether you think this was kind of a unique contribution of the Bolsheviks, or rather that the Bolsheviks just made the right decision, if that makes sense as a question?
Well, the Bolsheviks did make the right decision. You knew I was going to say that. No, look, that is a really important question, but I also wanted to respond to some of the points that Eric made, and I feel like I'll go on too long if I respond to both things. So if you don't mind, I'll pivot your question to Brian to come after
Sure.
I speak. But I think a lot of important points came out. I mean, I have lots of disagreements, but a lot of important points came up that are really worthy of discussion and debate, and this will be really valuable to clarify a lot of things. I mean, one of the things that I've been thinking is, Eric talks about rupture a lot, but never explains what is it, what is that rupture, and what does it mean by rupture, and how is it going to happen? And when we talk about how it's going to happen, he says, and he quotes Kautsky in saying that, well, there's no formula. But we don't claim there's any formula. And in fact, I don't agree with the terminology of recipe. It's not a recipe. It's science. And what Lenin and the Bolsheviks did was based on the scientific conclusions they themselves drew, and what the scientific conclusions that Marx and Engels drew. So it's not about blindly following something without questioning it. And certainly we would not have been successful in our actual work, in the here and now, if we didn't take strategy and tactics seriously, or if we had some sort of sledgehammerish sort of follower kind of approach, we would not have won anything. So in reality, we have to understand that Marxism is, contrary to these pejorative terms that are being thrown out. And, this is not the first time, in every era when socialist ideas become powerful in the Russian Revolution, there's a new generation looking to the Russian Revolution for inspiration. There's another generation of, spokespeople who will sort of underplay or undermine the ideas of the Russian Revolution and then use words like recipe and so on. But really, it's a scientific approach. And as I said, it's being obstinate about following the logic of capitalism in terms of the class antagonisms and looking at evidence dispassionately. So, Eric mentioned Latin America, for example. Well, look at what's happening all over across Latin America. Look at what's happening in Peru, and all of the countries across the globe. If you've been following what's happening in Pakistan, in Sri Lanka, in Sudan, I mean, in country after country, including the United States. I mean, so we're talking about a broad swath of countries at various levels of industrialization, very, very extremely troubled and poverty-stricken, neocolonial countries to the United States, the richest country. And you're seeing that across the board today, what the situation is not some tremendous faith in the parliamentary institutions, but it is actually quite the opposite. In fact, I'm struck by how dramatically different reality is compared to the way it's being portrayed here. In fact, the credibility of the democratic institutions of capitalism that's in tatters today, including the U.S. I mean, if you looked at the recent polls, it's just stunning. And so, I think it's important, and this is the clarity that Marxism brings, which is not a debate about if working people want to fight for democratic reforms, we shouldn't. It would be stupid, and this is a straw man argument to say that Marxists, reject fighting for democratic reform because that's not socialism, and if workers want to fight for it, we say no. No, it's absolutely not the case, and it's a simplistic and completely devoid of reality kind of argument. What is different about Marxists is that we absolutely will fight tooth and nail. And in fact, we have the best track record as Marxists. I don't just mean essay of winning reforms, but what we bring is the unshakable clarity that of not having faith in those parliamentary reforms or in democratic reforms, and in understanding that we have to fight to win. If working people are willing to get organized and everything, we should do that. But while being clear that this is not going to be socialism through the ballot box kind of argument. And in fact, we bring history, our historical evidence, our historical understanding to bear to understand that. And in fact, Chile is an important example of why the parliamentary road to socialism is a dead end, and it's actually devastating and deadly dead end. We know Salvador Allende, who was a self-proclaimed Marxist. I mean, the party members were self-proclaimed Marxists. He was elected to Chile in 1970. This is an important test case for this parliamentary road to socialism, it failed miserably despite all the best intentions and deep heroism. And in fact, many of them were absolutely heroic. This was a tragic defeat that ushered in a brutal military dictatorship that killed tens of thousands of people and then provided testing ground for the ideas of neoliberalism. Now, that doesn't mean rejecting what happened in Chile, but understanding why certain things happened a certain way. It's not about parochialism, like, lauding the Russian Revolution versus everything else. No, it is about learning objective lessons from every revolutionary struggle, and what worked and what didn't work. And what happened there, Allende and his party were naive. They thought they could win over sections of the military brass. When the elected officials tried to avoid conflict and preserve parliament, the working class got organized to prepare for power, and the ruling class got ready for counter-revolution, right? And in this real-life example of an attempt at a parliamentary road to socialism, the elected officials, as I said, despite best intentions, held the movement back. They did not lead the movement towards that. Actually, there was a tussle of ideas among the most militant workers on the one hand, and big sections of the leadership. And the workers organized their workers' councils, even citywide bodies. They took factories into democratic public ownership. But what happened was the Allende government, because they had illusions, and we have to be clear, it is massive illusions in the parliamentary process that that meant that they discouraged all of this militant organizing by the workers. And in some cases, stunningly, they even handed the factories back to the capitalists, factories that the workers had taken into their control. So in other words, the situation of dual power did come into existence because militant workers were clear that that is the road to go, not parliamentary road. It did provide an opening for working class rule, but yet again, there was no leadership akin to the Bolsheviks in Russia during 1917. And here again, I will take objection to one of the points that Eric made in his introduction, that we apparently that we put too much blame on the lack of correct leadership. No, it's actually a proportionate critique that we have, that right now obstacle to building revolutionary movements is the lack of correct leadership. It's not the lack of willingness of workers to actually come forward. And what did Allende do? He tried to make compromises with the forces of intense right-wing reaction, and they ruthlessly crushed him and the most active workers. I mean, there was literally a river of blood. So this negative example shows the dangers of relying on ready-made state machinery of elected bodies created by capitalism. And I'll just again reiterate a point I made earlier, is again, Chile is also one of the important illustrations of why Marxist logic points towards internationalism and for the need for an international Marxist organization that is able to bring to bear genuine solidarity and also strategy and tactics to fight against the forces of global imperialism. Because even if the Allende government had the Marxist clarity, which they didn't, again, alone they would not have been able to withstand the might and just the brutality of U.S. imperialism. And so, without internationalism, the idea of socialism is a non-starter.
Okay, a lot going on there. Even just in an audible sense.
Yes.
Same.
Yes. Yeah, I thought her dog was making some really sharp points in that last section.
For sure.
Objected at all the right moments. Yeah. No, there is a lot to say about what Kshama herself said here, but since we are a little over the 2-hour mark, I think it is time to go to the post game for patrons to watch the last piece of this. I think we have 20, 25 minutes, something like that left. So we are going to do that now. If you are a patron, you should already have a link. I believe Varn, you're also streaming this, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. If you want, I can send you that post game link so you can post it for your
patrons. All right.
Yep. For the Varn blog. The VVPs. Okay, so we are going to do that now. So we will address everything that Kshama and her dog and her phone said in that last section.
And Eric before that, obviously, because she was talking to him.
Yes, also last but not least, Eric Blanc. We'll address all of that in the post game. We'll see you on the other side in just a minute. Left is best.